To an unprecedented look at the great economic divide in America. While many reports have documented the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, nothing has gone as in-depth as this. In turning now to an unprecedented look at the great economic divide in America. While many reports have documented the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, nothing has gone as in-depth as this new report. It's a new study by the Martin Prosperity Institute, and they don't rely solely on income, but they also combine that with measures of education and also occupational segregation. The finding? Americans aren't just segregating into cities, country, and the suburbs, but the rich and poor occupy completely different worlds even within the same town. And the nation's 3 largest metro areas are also some of the most segregated. Friend of the show, Richard Florida, is director of the Martin Prosperity Institute and joins us now. Richard, tell us a little bit, broad strokes, about your findings. We're going to dig into them more in a moment, and also why this matters. Why does economic segregation, why is that an important phenomenon to study?
Well, as you guys know, this country has been consumed by a conversation about inequality. Inequality's grown, it's devastating, and it has terrible effects for everyone who is experiencing it. But one of the things we found is that this inequality isn't an abstract phenomenon. It is literally baked into our cities and our neighborhoods. And when we looked at this economic segregation, we looked at it by income levels, by the level of education people have, and by the kinds of work they do. Do you do a high-paid knowledge or management job? Do you toil in a low-paid service job? And what we found is not only is segregation growing, but it's hardening in places across the country. You know, 4 of the most segregated metros in the United States are in Texas, but also, as you said, our big cities, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, show very high and increasing levels of economic segregation.
Well, Richard, let's dig into that point right there. Austin, you say, is the most segregated city in America. Orlando is the least segregated. So if you and I went and took a visit, say a 3-4 day visit in Austin and then Orlando, how would we see those differences manifested?
Well, we'd see people living in different kinds of neighborhoods. You know, I know Austin really well, and it takes you know, it's an east-west divide. If you live on one side of the city, you live around highly educated, high-income techies or musicians. If you live on the, and who are mainly white or maybe somewhat multicultural, if you live on the other side of the city, you live in a poor neighborhood, you know, served by schools that aren't nearly as good, with much less public services, in an area that's Hispanic and largely Hispanic and black. So one of the things we're finding is that in our country, even people who live in the same city, it's not just inequality by socioeconomic class. Even if people live in the same city, even if it's an affluent city, Austin's one of the most successful tech cities in the country. Even if it's an affluent city, we see this divide reinforced, people living in completely different universes.
Yeah, you guys have both mentioned the state of Texas. Cities in that state top your list when it comes to economic segregation. Houston's number 4, Austin number 1. I sat down with Rick Perry about a year ago, and I asked him what he thought about raising the minimum wage, and here's what he told me. So you would support raising it, just not at the federal level?
Listen, if somebody wants to raise somebody's salary, that's not my business. And it shouldn't be government's business to be mandating what people pay individuals out there. If you want to kill jobs, raise the minimum wage.
So, Richard, if raising the minimum wage is going to be part of the way that we bridge this divide, and if it's not politicians and government that do that, whose responsibility then is it?
Well, first of all, Perry's comment, as you know, is nonsensical. We know from all of the good research done on this by the leading economists at Berkeley, the University of Massachusetts, that raising that minimum wage to 50 or 60% of the local prevailing wage. In a place like Austin or San Francisco, that's about $15 an hour. Somebody could live, not great, but they could live on that. That has no ill effect on workers' jobs or the local economy. Look, as a society, we've got to lift up the bottom. We know that's the problem. You know, one thing this report points out is the problem isn't the top 1%. That's an issue. The problem is at the lagging bottom. And I understand we have a lot of attention going to the 1%. But boy, oh boy, as a country, we need to pay attention of the people who are falling further and further behind and lift them up. And one very good way to do, not the only way, a very good way to do that is by raising that local minimum wage.
All right, Richard Florida, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
It's great to be with you guys.
And up next,